Okay, I think we're ready to go. Hi, everyone. So we might be getting some people joining slowly as I'm giving this introduction, but yeah, we wanted to get started right on time at 8 a.m. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to Egap's first policy brief webinar. My name is Max Mendez-Beck. I'm the Meetings and Membership Manager at Egap. So part of my role is to organize these types of events and to help disseminate some of the latest research by our members. Kind of wanted to give a quick intro to Egap for those who aren't familiar. We are Evidence in Governance and Politics. So we're a network of 235 academics and practitioners who from around the world with expertise in areas of institutions and governance, poverty reduction and inequality, elections and representation, as well as conflict mitigation and migration. Part of the work we do involves sharing the latest academic research with scholars, policymakers, and practitioners. So we regularly feature new papers on our websites as policy briefs, but this is the first time we're organizing a webinar based on a recently published policy brief. So we're really excited to have to be joined by Kristin Michelitch and Jeremy Horowitz, who will be presenting their findings on the paper How Personal Narratives Reduce Negative Attitudes Towards Refugees and Immigrant Outgroups in Kenya. So Kristin is an Egap member and an assistant professor of political science at Vanderbilt University. And Jeremy is assistant professor in the government department at Dartmouth College. Before I hand things off to Kristin and Jeremy, I just wanted to go over some quick housekeeping. So this session is being recorded, and we will be sharing the recording with you after we finish up here. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you have questions that come up during the presentation, please feel free to post them in the chat. One of the presenters, if they're not presenting, can respond in the chat itself if it's a quick clarifying question. If it's a broader question, then it'll be addressed at the end of the presentation. So yeah, once the presentation is complete, we'll go through all the questions in the chat box and then open it up to any other questions people may have. And we'll be using the raised hand function. So with that, I think we can hand it off to Kristin and Jeremy.
Thank you, Max. And hi, everybody. Thanks for taking time out to come to this talk. I know everyone's incredibly busy and the world is very crazy now. So it really means a lot to us that you've decided to spend some time with us this morning. I'm going to share my screen. And I should say that the paper is also co-authored with a former Vanderbilt graduate student, Nicole Audette, who worked incredibly hard on this project. You know, she's not here with us today. She works now in the policy sector, but we did want to recognize her as a co-author. So today we're going to talk about how personal narratives reduce negative attitudes towards immigrants in Kenya. Let's see, there's a little Egap slide. And the study motivation really derives from the idea that the world's count of refugees and immigrants is at an all-time high, but we're also seeing a lot of public backlash towards what we call immigrant outgroups. However, we've seen in a lot of research that these attitudes are pretty tough to change. Generally, negative attitudes towards ethnic outgroups or religious outgroups or other kind of attitudes towards groups are fairly sticky. And existing interventions have shown a lot of null results, meager results, or at times mixed results. Some of these interventions are also difficult to scale, so at low cost to bring to a large group of people. So some of the existing interventions you might be familiar with if you're privy to this sector. One kind of intervention is fact-based intervention, so informing people how many immigrants are entering or refugees are entering the country. Usually people believe that it's a lot more than it actually is. but meager results have been shown there. There's also some intergroup contact interventions. A lot of them have null results in the area of attitudes towards immigrant groups or other ethnic groups. But there's been some promising results towards other groups, such as transgender individuals. And then there's also been perspective taking exercises where people are asked to put themselves in the shoes of a refugee or an immigrant, and there's been some mixed results there. Oftentimes what happens is that might boost people who are already favorably predisposed to refugees or immigrants to maybe take action on behalf of these groups to support them, but it doesn't necessarily change the attitudes, especially of those who are negatively predisposed towards these immigrant outgroups. So one thing that we noticed that hasn't really been tested in this area is something that's a common technique used by a lot of immigration advocacy groups, and that is the personal narrative. So we've seen in the media that generally news articles or debates are largely negative about refugees and immigrant groups, but increasingly we're seeing the rise of immigrants or refugees' own stories being put out into the public space, trying to maybe make the audience empathize or maybe demystify individuals that they probably in the course of everyday life have never encountered. So we're seeing this all over the world, and the question is, well, does that work to change attitudes? So just a kind of overview of the study, we ask whether refugees and other immigrant outgroup members' personal narratives can reduce prejudicial attitudes towards them and improve support for policies aimed at benefiting them. And our study is going to take place in Kenya, where Kenyan nationals are presented with one of two personal narratives or a controlled condition. And one of the narratives is from a Somali refugee, and it's focused on the hardships of being a refugee and fleeing violence. The second narrative is from a longer-term ethnic Somali citizen of Kenya, and this narrative focuses on solidarity against terrorism between Somalis and other Kenyans. And our results are pretty exciting. So we find that both of these narratives reduced prejudicial attitudes towards Somali refugees and citizens, and that it increases support for directly related beneficial policies. And one thing that we're particularly excited about is that our effects are actually as large, or in some cases larger, among those who are negatively predisposed towards Somalis. So we really were interested in, will this just preach to the choir, or can it actually move the attitudes of the negatively predisposed? So we find some positive evidence there. Okay, so I'll just briefly talk a little bit about the theoretical foundation of why personal narratives might be particularly effective to change attitudes. And so for this, we draw on transport theory, which is mostly championed by people in the communications sphere. And also, we've seen this in international development recently, called edutainment. I think there's some audience members who have been involved in some edutainment interventions here. So thanks for joining. So the idea behind transport theory that we listen to a personal narrative and that it might work to change attitudes is based on the idea that listening to such a narrative both cognitively and emotionally immerses the listener into the other person's perspective. And by doing so, this may increase the acceptance of new information or perspectives from that person. So there's a few reasons why, a few mechanisms why this might work. One is that it's might be hard to discount or reject another person's personal experience. So nowadays, people are rejecting facts all the time. Where did it come from? I don't know. I don't believe it. Is it manipulated? Is something left out, et cetera, et cetera. And so people might reject facts or other types of information. By contrast, it's very difficult if someone says, here's my story, or here's my, perspective on behalf of my group in this case, to kind of reject that. A second aspect of it is that it reduces counter-arguing. So this idea is basically that people enjoy listening to somebody else's story. And the idea is that this enjoyment is reduced if you start rejecting it or discounting it. You sort of get more enjoyment out of continuing the immersion in the other person's story. The third aspect is that it may evoke empathy. So this is maybe something that happens through implicit perspective taking. Again, being in the shoes of this other person helps to improve empathy without people really trying. This literature talks about sort of automatic empathy that's aroused through standing in the other person's shoes. And then the fourth aspect is that it can be attention grabbing. So versus other presentations of information or other experiences, personal narratives might really, pique somebody's interest and have them grant quite a bit of attention since it's interesting. So in the communications field, research has often shown that personal narratives can be more effective than facts or kind of other types of ways to give information, but most of this research is in uncontroversial topic areas. So in product advertising, in public health, where goals are typically aligned. You want to be healthy, so you're interested to learn and not reject the information. It's also been studied a lot with children sort of education, but there's less evidence on controversial topics. And I think there's a lot of growing research and interest around, edutainment being used for this, but we've had still some mixed results there. We're still learning. Okay, so next I'm going to just talk a little bit about the study context. So our study context is going to be in Kenya ahead of the 2017 national elections. And we're interested in attitudes towards Somalis, and in particular, two types of Somalis. The first is Somali refugees, and the second is Somali Kenyans, people who are ethnic Somali citizens of Kenya. So why Kenya? We think it's really important to study the global South. A lot of the literature on attitudes towards refugees and immigrants is conducted in the global North, but actually over 80% of refugees are hosted in global South countries. And in fact, 31% are in sub-Saharan Africa. So there really needs to be more attention paid to a lot of the different dynamics that might occur in a global South setting versus a global North setting in terms of why people are having negative attitudes. And this might be a review for many of you, but there's a conflict in Somalia that started in the 1990s, and it produced one of the largest refugee populations in the world. The vast majority of these refugees are in neighboring countries in East Africa, including Kenya. And Kenya is actually a country that has quite a large number of refugees, globally speaking. And there are refugees that are not Somalis from other surrounding countries. But I guess the majority, 55% of refugees in Kenya are Somalis. A lot of these refugees live in the Dadaab refugee camp, which you can see on the map there, but a lot of people live in Nairobi. And there's a neighborhood in Nairobi that is known as a Somali neighborhood, and one can find many Somali Kenyans and also Somali refugees there. So it's important also to point out for people who might not be specialists of sub-Saharan Africa that a lot of African countries have a mix of ethnic groups, and sometimes these groups are sort of bisected or I guess you'd call this multiple sected into different countries. And this is a feature of colonial borders that have been relatively sticky. So it's important to point out that Somalis have, I guess always been in Kenya since before independence. So you can see on the map here, the pink area shows where Somali speakers tend to exist. And we see that there's a large region of Kenya where there is quite a lot of Somalis. But even still, Somalis are about 2.8 million citizens in Kenya, in a country of a little bit over 48 million citizens. So this isn't a dominant ethnic group in Kenya, but it's sort of considered a peripheral ethnic group. And Somalis are portrayed very negatively in the media in Kenya, both refugees and ethnic Somali citizens. They're known to be brutalized by police in the election, and otherwise they're often scapegoated. They're associated with the terrorist group Al-Shabaab that had committed a few acts of terrorism that really hurt the nation as a whole. And people kind of negatively associate the refugees and the citizens themselves as extremists or terrorists or people who are prone to be recruited by these groups. So this actually led to a very controversial issue, which was that the Kenyan government suggested that it was going to close the Dadaab refugee camp and kind of oust these citizens to go back to Somalia, where they would certainly be very unsafe. And then actually the UNHCR and other groups came and fought and said, oh, this is, you can't do this, et cetera, et cetera. But that is something that's, was on the table policy-wise. There's also been an attempt to build a wall on the Somali-Kenya border. There was a lot of corruption scandals around this wall, and it was very controversial because it's a long border and will it work, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of issues around what to do with refugees. People are now on multiple generations in refugee camps, some people being born in these refugee camps, will they be citizens, and those sorts of issues. So we actually did an original media content analysis with a couple of the leading Kenyan newspapers in the year leading up to our experiment. And basically we coded these newspaper articles and we divided up into any mention of Somalis, Somali refugees in particular, Somali Kenyans, or kind of Somalia, the country, and diaspora. And then we coded it on, the content. We see that regardless of which group we're talking about, overwhelmingly, what the article relates is violence or insecurity threats. Some few articles also talk about economic issues and maybe some cultural issues. But overwhelmingly, this gives us a picture of how frequently people are receiving information that is negative about violence and insecurity about Somalis. So I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy and give people a little stretch break. And yeah, okay. Jeremy, are you able to share your screen?
I believe so. Let's find out. And let me go full screen. Okay, can you see my slides? Beautiful, great. Thank you, Kristin. So what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit more about what we did in this study concretely, and then discuss our results and briefly mention a couple policy implications and next steps before we open up for some Q&A and discussion. So as Kristin mentioned, we were interested in crafting narratives that were based on the sentiments from members of the Somali community in their own words, so to speak. And so as part of this process, we first held a bunch of interviews with folks in Nairobi to get a sense of what are their priorities and interests here. And then we worked with a local advocacy group in Eastleywood. Eastleigh is the neighborhood in Nairobi that is predominantly Somali. And this is a group that has a history of developing media content designed to bridge the gap between Somalis in Kenya and non-Somali Kenyans. And so we distilled down what we heard through the interviews into two distinct narratives. One that primarily reflected the views and thoughts from more recent refugee arrivals, predominantly concerned about the status of refugees in Kenya and some of the policy debates Kristin mentioned. And then another set of concerns from longer term Somali residents, whether they were naturalized citizens or born in Kenya, that focused much more on this rising perception over the last decade that Somalis support al-Shabaab and terrorism. So we crafted two treatments, two scripts that were recorded with actors from this local partner. They were each about 2 minutes in length. So these are fairly long treatments. And we conducted an experiment where we embedded this within a larger household survey that we conducted in Nairobi County, which includes the central urban area as well as some of the peripheral areas, capital city. That included a little over 1,100 respondents in June of 2017. And in the interviews, we randomly assigned participants either to a control group that received neither of the treatments, neither of the narratives, or one or the other of these audio recordings. And so we have a baseline in the control group against which to assess whether either of these shift attitudes or not. This was done as part of a large-scale survey in which we randomly selected neighborhoods and then randomly selected households within those neighborhoods and participants within those households. So we have a pretty nice representative sample of Nairobi County. And we were interested in looking at a variety of outcome measures that we thought plausibly might be shifted here, some of which fall into intergroup attitudes and perspectives and beliefs across group lines, and others relate to some of the more specific policy measures relevant to these groups. So let me tell you a little bit more about the first narrative, which we refer to as treatment one or T1, or we refer to as the refugee hardship narrative. And so this was the message that describes one person's journey fleeing violence in Somalia, crossing over into Kenya, first living in the north of Kenya and then settling in Dadaab, where life was hard but safe, and expressing gratitude for safe refuge in Kenya. So we used a group of 5 outcome measures here, and I'll just briefly describe what those looked like and give you a sense of what baseline attitudes were among the control group. And the big picture here, kind of consistent with what other scattered public opinion survey research in Kenya has shown in recent years, is that attitudes are pretty negative, more so than positive on most of these indicators. So one thing we looked at was simply how close do you feel to Somalis, where 10 would be very close, 0 not close at all. And you can see the mean here, 2.93, is more on the lower end of that scale. Then a group of 4 policy-oriented outcomes. What's your perspective on government spending? Do you think it's too low or not? Only 20% saying that spending is too low. Do you support or oppose building a wall along the Somali-Kenya border, with strong opposition in this case being 0 and strong support being 10. So the mean here is more on the being supportive of building a wall than opposing. And then 2 questions that I think most directly tie into current debates. We asked, what percentage of Somali refugees currently in Kenya do you think should be given citizenship rights? And here the percentage The mean was 29.7, so about 1 in 3. And then finally, I think most interestingly in this regard is, do you think Dadaab should be kept open? And as Kristin noted, by the time we implemented this research, there had been major national debates going on about the status of Dadaab. And we see support among about 45% of respondents for keeping Dadaab open. We then also generated an index which averages these 5 items together. We rescale everything from 0 to 1 so that we can compare the magnitude of the effects, with larger numbers being more positive perceptions or support for beneficial policies. And here's what we found. So on the left side, labeled predicted values here, you see the mean values in the control group. Again, the respondents, there were about 350 of them who didn't hear any recording, relative to the mean values for those who heard the refugee hardship recording, again, via headphones in the context of a household-based survey. We see positive movement for the index that averages these 5 indicators, and kind of scattered evidence across each of the specific items. But what we thought was particularly noteworthy is that on these, I think, most relevant, most immediate and directly relevant policy outcomes, we see some movement that is, in some cases, not insubstantial. So an increase of 7 percentage points in the share of current Somali refugees in Kenya who ought to be granted citizenship rights. This might look somewhat small, and perhaps it is, but granting citizenship, I think, is kind of a high hurdle. And so the fact that we get any movement there is noteworthy. But then here, with regard to keeping Dadaab open, we see a 17 percentage point increase. And that's going from about 45% in the control group up to around 62%. And so again, that struck us as meaningful substantively. Okay, so let me tell you now about the second narrative, and this one we call the anti-terror narrative, or treatment 2. And to recall, this was a narrative that really emerged out of what we were hearing from longer-term Somali citizens. And here, the narrative isn't so much a biographical account of someone's history, it's much more a first-person perspective, meant to condemn Al-Shabaab and Islamic terrorism more broadly, to emphasize points of commonality and solidarity across Somali Muslims and Christian Kenyans. The majority of non-Somali Kenyans, overwhelming majority, are Christian, and so an effort to express solidarity across these social divisions, and to articulate a shared interest in combating this common enemy of Al-Shabaab. So we designed a set of indicators that are specifically related to the content of this message. The one common one that we used with the previous narrative is this question of how close do you feel to Somalis? And then we were interested in a larger number of perception-based questions. Do you view Somalis as peaceful? Do you believe that they support or oppose terrorism? Do you view Somalis as nationalists, that is, concerned about the welfare of the entirety of Kenya, or more narrowly interested in their own group's affairs? And the means here are pretty low. I mean, mostly what we're seeing is a lot of negative perceptions of Somalis, fairly negative perceptions in most instances. And then on the policy side, we have this very blunt question, but I think an important one, that simply asked, do you think Somalis should remain in Kenya or be encouraged, whether voluntarily or perhaps forcefully, to leave Kenya? Do Somalis belong, in other words, which has been this very contentious issue since independence and before. And here we see 58% saying yes, Somalis should remain in Kenya. You could look at that as positive. On the other hand, you could say, well, that's 42% who say no, which might strike many of us as a pretty large number. And then finally, this question of, do you think Kenya is better off keeping Northeast Province, this area along the Somali border that Kristin mentioned, that is predominantly Somali? And do you think the country is better off retaining that area as part of the country or not? And again, there's been this long-running historical debate about whether or not this should be part of Somalia or should be Kenya. And we see very high support for retaining this area. And we think that's likely because while there may be lots of negative views of Somalis and perceptions of the connection perhaps to terrorism, even folks who hold those views probably don't want to see territorial concessions being made in this way. So again, we create an index that averages across these 6 outcomes. We rescale everything so they range from 0 to 1, with again, higher values being more positive views and more support for beneficial policies. And here again, we see on the left side of the screen, figure A, mean values in the control group relative to mean values in the group of respondents that was exposed to this second narrative. And on the right, we see the differences, the substantive effects. And we see here that pretty consistently, the narrative improved attitudes, both in terms of perceptions of Somalis as being peaceful, as being in opposition to terrorism, as being nationalist in orientation, as well as on these policy dimensions, a 14 percentage point increase in the view, for example, that Somalis have a place in Kenya, ought to remain in Kenya. And even here, though there was widespread support for retaining control of northeastern province, some movement there as well. So again, what might look like relatively small effects here, but we think the consistency of them across these various types of indicators, and given how sticky we might imagine attitudes towards immigration and immigrants and refugees might be, given that many people probably have pretty well solidified and ingrained attitudes to start with, we think these are meaningful results. Okay, so as Kristin mentioned, the other thing we wanted to do is look at whether these results simply obtain from moving people who already held positive views of Somalis in a more positive direction, preaching to the choir, so to speak, or do we also see evidence of positive movement among those who might be more resistant? And so we used a separate battery of questions to identify folks who we would anticipate being most resistant to movement here, most in opposition to, and most negatively predisposed. And so we conceive those folks as being people who think of Somalis as a greater security threat, believe that there's a stronger link between Somalis in Kenya and Al-Shabaab, for example, perceive Somalis to be a greater labor market threat. That is to say, think that Somalis in Nairobi are taking jobs that might otherwise go to non-Somali Kenyans. Perceive Somalis to be a greater cultural threat. That is to say, think of Islam as being very different from Christianity. So capturing very kind of distinct cultural practices and values, and simply have less contact in their ordinary days with members of the Somali community. So we broke our respondents down according to how they fell on these various metrics. And we have additional results I can show you graphically in the Q&A if folks are interested. But the big takeaway, as Kristin alluded to earlier, is that the effects I just showed you on the previous slides are generally as large, in some cases a little larger, for the folks who we see as being likely to be most resistant in the ways that we've defined here. So this we think is important, right? Particularly because we, suspect that advocacy organizations seeking to shift public attitudes oftentimes are aiming their interventions at the most resistant, not the most supportive. And so it's important to know whether movement can occur there as well. Very quickly, I'll wrap up with just a couple thoughts on policy implications and some next steps as we envision them. So one, and perhaps the most obvious policy implication here, is simply that we have some evidence for what is a widely used strategy by lots of advocacy organizations. It's not something that's been studied by academics so much, that seems to corroborate and confirm that this is a workable strategy. We think this is potentially, for some of the reasons that Kristin highlighted at the opening, a enticing intervention because it seems like one that could be scaled, that is, reach a large number of people at relatively low cost. and potentially were sort of interested in thinking about and learning about whether this could be done through radio or TV or social media type campaigns or other sorts of edutainment interventions, perhaps through podcasts or other types of media interventions that would use this strategy to reach not 1,000 people in the context of a household-based survey, but potentially many more people in various contexts. So in terms of next steps that we're thinking about currently, and would love to hear additional thoughts and reflections on these points in particular, this is one study that I think is exciting, but leaves unanswered all sorts of questions. And so one, for sure, is how effective can this strategy be in other contexts? And particularly we're thinking about the US or European contexts where we might expect that due to the politicization and perhaps the polarization across party lines of the discussion about hosting refugees and migrants, we might expect views to be particularly hardened and maybe more resistant. And so we want to see whether or not there is a possibility of this intervention working. As I already alluded, we're particularly keen to think about real world interventions, not kind of academic interventions of various types, and see whether or not we can observe the same size and types of effects that I've shown you here today. And then a critical question that is very much on our minds is how long might these effects last? And so what I've shown you here today, what we've shown you here today is based on questions that were asked immediately following people having listened to the narratives. And so we might think of that as kind of a upper limit in terms of the duration of the effects. We're curious weeks, months later, whether or not these attitude shifts endure. And finally, I'll just wrap up with mentioning a couple ideas we have regarding future collaborations. So one thing we very much intended and still do intend to do is to build on this set of results in the context they emerged out of in Kenya, in East Africa, perhaps other parts of Africa. And we're looking for and eager to identify partners who might be interested in working with us to think about designing some context relevant approaches, whether that would be a PSA campaign or radio campaign or podcasts or whatever would make sense, to try to build on in that context what we've found here. That work has been delayed, perhaps not surprising, due to the coronavirus, but we're still interested in hopefully keeping that moving before too long. And then the second piece that we're very much interested in is building on what I said a moment ago, thinking about interventions in the US and Europe contexts that would be particularly interesting to also examine. And again, looking to identify and hoping to identify partners who might want to work with us to think about how we would craft and implement some larger scale interventions where our role would probably be, Kristin and I's role would probably be more on thinking through how we might embed the research component in those interventions to allow for collecting credible evidence on whether or not these strategies work that could be hopefully beneficial to partner organizations, but also to the broader group of scholars and partners interested in working in this area. So I'll just end with an appeal, which is to say that partners are needed and partners are welcome. If you're interested in discussing some type of collaboration or know others who might be, we'd love to have those conversations with folks and think through whether there's a good fit there. Our contact info is here. You can also just contact us directly through the chat today. And so I'll stop there and thank everyone so much for being with us today and for your attention. And thanks to Max. I think we have a good bit of time left for discussion and Q&A. Again, we'd love to hear your thoughts on what we've done, but also what might be done building on these results going forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy and Kristin. Yeah, so we'll open it up to a Q&A session. So if anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to use the raise hand function if you want to ask the question. Yeah, and I'll unmute you, or also feel free to put the question into the chat and we can read it that way too. Either way works for us. Okay, Matthew, are you able to unmute yourself, Matthew? Yeah.
Thanks so much, Kristin and Jeremy, for this this great piece of research. Really cool to see it. I'd just be curious in some more operational details, like what did you say to people when you approached them to listen to these narratives? And then I'm sure you've thought a lot about the social desirability bias. Somebody just played me this narrative and now I'm getting asked a bunch of questions and I know what the right answer is. And so I'd be curious to hear you just talk a little bit about that, if you thought some of the measures avoided that more than others, or if you thought that there was anything that you did in the setup to help try and avoid
that. Jeremy, Kristin, either.
Jeremy, do you want to take that question?
Sure, happy to.
Maybe we should stop the screen share too.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I was wondering what to do about that. So let me stop the share. Okay, that's much better. Thanks for the question. So first, on how did we introduce this? The recordings were embedded in a longer household-based survey that asked for included a whole variety of questions focused on various facets of immigration. So I think if memory serves, the recordings fell about 2/3 or 3/4 through the interaction. And so by that point, the interviewers had already established a connection with and a rapport with the respondents. I don't remember precisely what the kind of intro script was. We had some sort of lead-in message to the effect of, now I'm going to play you a recording from so-and-so, and then I'll ask for your views afterwards. If you're interested, I can look those details up and pass them along to you by email. But this was, something that's fairly standard. I think, household surveys are quite common and folks in Nairobi are pretty used to participating in them, for better or worse. In terms of social desirability bias, this is for sure something we thought a lot about. And in the paper, which I'd also be happy to pass along if you want to see more details here, we ran a bunch of tests to try as best as possible to knock out, or at least provide some evidence on whether or not we're seeing real shifts in attitudes, or just people are sort of telling us what they think we want to hear after they've been exposed to the treatments. So one of the things we did, for example, was to look at folks who had been interviewed by somebody from their own ethnic group versus somebody from a different ethnic group. The idea being that people might be willing to be a bit more honest, particularly with negative sentiments, when they're interviewed by somebody from their own ethnic group, and there's some literature to that effect. We don't see any effect there. We don't see any difference there. We also included a whole battery of questions that asked about people's perceptions with regard to how neighbors and members of their community would view various types of negative public statements about actors in, folks within Kenya or other types of people internationally as well, to try to gauge how sensitive are individuals to this general concern about what will other people think about you if you say something negative. And so we created a index measure based on those questions. And again, we don't see any difference. People who seem to be highly sensitive versus those that are not. And so we did a couple things. It will never fully convince the hardcore skeptic that we've entirely eliminated that concern, but the tests we were able to run were encouraging.
We also did one more with bystanders. So in 37% of the sample, there were bystanders. And so we basically were looking to see if, treatment effects were still there, if we dropped those people, or if there was any like moderating effect. But we didn't find anything there either. So yeah, but hard to convince. We did have this under review, and there was one person who was like, I was not at all compelled by these 3 tests. So, you know, yeah.
Reviewer number 2, was that?
Yeah. But, you know, I think with any survey-based research, this is a concern. And so we, you know, did what we could there. I think it's also important too that people who are familiar with this context know that, you know, while there might be social desirability, I think, around the main partisan cleavage of conflict, like the Kikuyu, Luo, or, you know, those sorts of groups, people are very open about disdain for Somalis. I mean, our enumerators, when we were piloting and so forth, were saying negative stuff in front of us, you know, like, so it's sort of maybe we need to do more in the paper to talk about this, but I think it's tough for somebody coming from a global North context where it's so taboo, especially in the US, to say, you know, these negative things about a group. But in, you know, other contexts, it's just not like that. So yeah, I think the person who's concerned about that was definitely somebody, you know, that was based on the other comments, that was like a global North related scholar. I don't know.
We have another question from Claire Adida. Claire?
Hello.
Hi guys, sorry. So this is my morning Zoom look. I have to admit I was taking care of morning breakfast here with the kids, so I was in and out of paying attention. So apologies if you've addressed this, but obviously amazing work. I'm really excited about it. I love that you guys are doing this in the context of Kenya. So a couple questions. First, so for comment and question, your findings that you get results among people with negative baseline attitudes as well as preaching to the choir is really awesome and consistent with the stuff we got with the experiments we've done on perspective taking in the US, where we see people who are Trump supporters also responding to these treatments. So I like that there's kind of this consistency there. I had a couple questions. The first is thinking about semi-behavioral or behavioral measures, not just because of concerns with social desirability bias, but just, you know, if what we're thinking about is how to scale up or policy implications, moving beyond cheaper talk or signaling, then I'd love to just hear your thoughts on what are some ways in which we could, at low, you know, not at terribly high cost, get some kind of a behavioral measure on this outcome measure. And then the second question was, I'm trying to remember. Oh yes, do you guys have any evidence of any kind of any possible backlash effect? It's always something that I worry about. I haven't really seen it in my experiments, and I was wondering if you guys had seen any of that.
Yeah, good questions. Yeah, and we're excited to, now that we've presented this paper a few times, and it's been great to learn of like some recent working papers. And I feel like there's a lot of positive momentum. There's a lot of people who are like, let's figure this out and let's figure out what groups and what works and so forth. So that's really exciting. So for behavioral outcomes, I think for something that would be, you know, follow-on research in Kenya in particular, I think it wouldn't be all too hard if, and we would like to partner with either local organizations or international organization chapters there. It would be probably pretty easy to make like a podcast, like mimicking something that people would hear on the radio, and then have like a longer term, you know, people listen, you know, to an episode a week or something like that. And so we could do something like that and then use the classic placebo of like the environment, you know, or the hand washing placebo maybe. And then maybe do something where there's Confederate Somalis who sort of, you know, maybe like knock on the door, or I really like the recent research that Danny Choi and Nick Sambanis and Matthias Portner did, where they have people like dropping oranges at a train station and they're seeing like, oh, does somebody help them if they hear them on the cell phone, you know, talking in a certain way. So I think that it would be possible to hire kind of confederates in a similar manner, and then kind of see whether people would be, maybe willing, oh, can I use your phone to make a call, or can, something that's context specific. I think so we are actually, we've been designing in the last few weeks an online experiment in the United States in collaboration with John Sides. And I think my task for this next week was to comb through all the US studies to see the behavioral measures people are using and how they pull it off. And I know in some of your work, Claire, you've done, writing a letter, and there's petition signing and donating. So yeah, I think that was going to be my job, is to like try to scan what we can do online in the US. So if people have thoughts or knowledge of that, we would love to hear, what would work there.
Yeah, just as a response, petition signing is something you can easily track on Qualtrics whether somebody clicks on a link. So we've done that.
Yeah.
But it's also actually a hard thing it's a hard test because nobody wants to click on a link.
Yeah, I think our initial idea is that I think a lot of the US people will just be skeptical of a Kenya result. And so we want to kind of do a proof of concept online, easy experiment to show, like, can we see anything at all in the US, and then use that and the result that we have here to try to attract larger funding. Maybe we could apply to like Brussels Sage or other places that really care about this issue, and then try to do a larger suite of experiments where we can really test a lot of the mechanisms about the narrative, and maybe test that versus other things like the perspective taking or factual treatments, or basic things about like, how do you optimize a narrative, like, maybe it could be something that's more emotional versus not, or there's so many ways to kind of play around here. But we think that is not very ideal to do in a Kenyan context, where it's the household survey and so expensive, and kind of difficult logistically. So we thought that maybe some of those things are better addressed in a global North context, where maybe we could leverage the ease of the online survey, or maybe, if we do a little bit with online surveys in the US or Europe, then we could also think of like the podcast idea in the US as well, and something that might be more behavioral. But yeah, I think initially, I don't know, we think it might be hard to woo big money for US and Europe stuff with a Kenya study. Yeah.
And just very briefly on the question about backlash, we have a lot of outcome indicators, and we didn't see backlash overall or among subgroups that we looked at. So it doesn't seem to be. A skeptic could say, well, these are short-term effects, and maybe there's some social desirability bias, and so everything looks positive. But I think my intuition is that a lot of folks, even in Nairobi, don't have meaningful contact with Somalis, and we see that in our survey data. And so attitudes maybe aren't super tightly anchored, even though these issues have been in the public sphere. But it seems like a population where there's some potential for real movement and not a lot of likely backlash.
Yeah, one interesting comment that we got when we presented at the Immigration Policy Lab at Stanford, David Layton sort of made the point that, even though this is a politicized group, and we talked a little bit about how it was politicized leading up to the election, he was like, well, I don't, would it work if you tried to do this for Kikuyu and Luo, where there's like these very intense, deeply seated attitudes? And so that sparked a larger discussion about, basically for what groups, what types of groups might this work, at least easily. And so it might be that if there's this, when the groups are tied to political competition, that would be extremely difficult. But then for more kind of peripheral groups that don't kind of fall on neatly on either side of a political divide, that it could work better. So like Anna Bracic, for example, who does work on the Roma in Europe, thought like, oh, well, you know, this is politicized, but also, you know, it's a small group. You know, they are discriminated against heavily, but, you know, this isn't just, you know, one of the major, you know, cleavages of conflict politically, or, you know, it could be in Europe, some of the diaspora from former colonies, you know, obviously they're politicized in many ways, but, you know, they're still not, you know, maybe the major, you know, it's not the same as in an African country where groups are, you know, forming these political parties kind of on these coinciding cleavages. So we need more research. Yeah.